The classified briefing room fell silent as Major Derek Harrison slid a manila folder across the polished conference table. Inside was a photograph of a compound that had broken 12 elite operators in 6 months. The target that intelligence agencies called the Vault, a fortress buried in the Nevada desert that no one had ever successfully penetrated. But Cindy Fowler wasn't like the others. She was about to prove that the biggest mistake wasn't underestimating the target, it was underestimating her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across Fort Bragg's Delta Force Selection Facility, a sprawling complex where America's most elite soldiers were forged in steel and silence. The compound stretched across barren ground like a metallic organism, all sharp angles and reinforced concrete, designed to intimidate before training even began. Guard towers punctuated the perimeter, their occupants scanning with practiced eyes that missed nothing. This wasn't just a military base. It was a cathedral of warfare, where only the chosen few earned the right to wear the coveted Delta insignia. Inside the main assessment building, fluorescent lights buzzed over sterile corridors lined with achievement plaques dating back decades. Photos of legendary operators stared down from the walls, men whose faces had been blurred for security, but whose presence still commanded respect. The air carried the scent of gun oil, industrial cleaning compounds, and something else, the unmistakable weight of expectation. Every surface gleamed with military precision, from the buffed linoleum floors to the spotless windows that revealed nothing of the secrets held within. The evaluation chamber occupied the building's heart, a windowless room where candidates faced their first formal assessment. 24 chairs arranged in precise rows faced a raised platform where senior operators would deliver verdicts that could end careers before they started. The walls displayed no decoration save for a single American flag and the Delta Force motto etched in brushed steel, De oppresso liber, to free the oppressed. The message was clear. Only those capable of the impossible need apply. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen reviewed his clipboard with mechanical precision, his uniform crisp despite the early hour. Beside him, Captain Jake Morrison stretched his shoulders, the fabric of his tactical shirt straining slightly over muscles earned through years of combat deployments. Both men had seen hundreds of candidates cycle through this room. Special Forces veterans, Navy SEALs, Marine Raiders, warriors who arrived confident and left humbled. They knew the type, disciplined, experienced, mentally prepared for the brutality that Delta selection promised. Today's roster contained the usual suspects. Former Rangers with combat experience in 3 theaters. A Navy SEAL who'd completed 2 successful hostage rescues. Marines whose service records read like action movie scripts. These were operators who'd already proven themselves in the crucible of modern warfare. Soldiers who understood that Delta Force represented the apex of military achievement. The competition would be fierce, the standards unforgiving. Morrison scanned the candidate files, noting deployment histories and specialized training certifications. Thompson's got good numbers from Afghanistan, he remarked, tapping one folder. Rivera survived 3 IED strikes and kept his unit intact. Patterson completed Ranger School in the top 5%. These weren't weekend warriors or glory seekers. They were proven professionals seeking to join an even more exclusive brotherhood. Chen nodded, making notes on his evaluation sheets. "What about the woman?" he asked, pulling a thinner file from the stack. The photograph showed a face that seemed almost out of place among the hardened features surrounding it. Younger, softer somehow, with eyes that held intelligence rather than the cold intensity typical of special operations candidates. Fowler, Cindy Marie, Morrison read from the summary page. Current assignment, Intelligence Analyst, Fort Gordon. Previous experience, Signals Intelligence, Data Interpretation, Administrative Support roles. He paused, frowning at the sparse combat experience section. No overseas deployments, no special operations training, no advanced weapons certifications. The contrast was striking. Where other files bulged with commendations, combat ribbons, and specialized course completions, Fowler's record seemed almost civilian in its simplicity. Her performance evaluations were solid but unremarkable. Consistent ratings of meets expectations, with occasional notes about attention to detail and analytical thinking. Nothing suggested the exceptional physical capabilities or psychological resilience that Delta Force demanded. How did she even qualify for selection? Chen wondered aloud, scanning the eligibility requirements. Delta Force maintains some of the strictest entry standards in the military, requiring candidates to demonstrate not just physical excellence, but proven performance under extreme stress. Most applicants spent years preparing, accumulating the specialized training and combat experience necessary to even receive consideration. Morrison shrugged, though his expression suggested the same confusion. Personnel says her application met minimum requirements, passed the physical fitness tests, cleared the psychological evaluations, had the necessary security clearances. He closed the folder with a slight shake of his head. Sometimes people slip through the cracks in the system. Outside, the first candidates began arriving at the facility's main entrance. They emerged from transport vehicles with the confident bearing of professional soldiers, their movements efficient and purposeful. Gear bags hit the ground with practiced thuds as they organized their equipment with military precision. These men had trained for this moment, planned for it, dreamed of joining the ranks of America's most secretive warriors. The morning air carried their quiet conversations, tactical discussions about selection phases, speculation about evaluation criteria, the kind of shop talk that bonded elite soldiers. They wore their experience like armor, comfortable in their shared understanding of military culture, and confident in their abilities to meet whatever challenges awaited them inside. Then she arrived. Cindy Fowler stepped from a standard military transport, and the change in atmosphere was immediate, though subtle. Conversations didn't stop, but they shifted in tone. Eyes tracked her movement, not with the respectful assessment given to fellow warriors, but with curiosity tinged by skepticism. Her uniform was regulation perfect, her posture correct, her demeanor professional, yet something about her presence seemed to question the natural order of this masculine domain. She moved with quiet confidence, shouldering her gear bag without fanfare, and walking toward the entrance with steady steps. But those observing noticed what she wasn't. She wasn't built like a powerlifter or scarred by combat experience. She didn't carry herself with the aggressive swagger common among special operations veterans. Instead, she projected a different kind of strength. Intellectual, analytical, patient. "That's our female candidate," someone murmured, the words carrying just far enough to reach neighboring groups. The observation wasn't malicious, merely factual, but it established an immediate distinction. In a world where being one of the guys often meant being exactly like the guys, Cindy Fowler represented something different, an unknown variable in an equation built on proven constants. Her approach to the facility entrance was watched by multiple sets of eyes, each observer making rapid assessments based on limited information. Some saw a diversity hire, someone elevated beyond her natural station by political correctness rather than merit. Others reserved judgment, understanding that Delta Force's reputation for excellence wouldn't be compromised by social engineering. A few wondered if her presence represented something more, a test perhaps, or an experiment in expanding operational capabilities. Captain Morrison and Staff Sergeant Chen observed her arrival through the briefing room's reinforced windows, both men noting the subtle shift in group dynamics as she integrated with the other candidates. She didn't seem to notice or care about the attention, focusing instead on the task ahead with the same professional detachment she'd likely applied to countless intelligence briefings. "Interesting," Morrison commented, though his tone revealed nothing of his thoughts. In his experience, candidates who stood out before selection even began faced additional challenges: the weight of expectation, the burden of representation, the constant need to prove they belonged. Whether Cindy Fowler possessed the resilience to handle such pressure remained to be seen. The morning briefing would begin soon, and with it, the first phase of an evaluation process designed to strip away pretense and reveal the core capabilities that separated true warriors from merely competent soldiers. In this crucible of elite military culture, assumptions would be tested, limitations exposed, and only the exceptional would advance to the next level. Cindy Fowler straightened her uniform one final time and walked through doors that had welcomed America's finest warriors for decades. Behind her, 23 of the military's most promising candidates followed, each carrying their own expectations of what lay ahead. None of them, including the evaluators waiting inside, could have predicted how fundamentally this particular selection cycle would challenge everything they thought they knew about excellence, capability, and the true nature of impossible missions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The briefing room filled with the controlled energy of elite soldiers settling into formation. 24 candidates arranged themselves in the precisely aligned chairs, their movements economical and purposeful. The morning light streaming through high windows illuminated faces that had seen combat in every major theater of the past decade. These weren't fresh recruits seeking adventure. They were seasoned professionals pursuing the ultimate validation of their skills. Cindy Fowler took her assigned seat in the third row, her notebook already open to a clean page, pen positioned for efficient note-taking. Around her, candidates performed the subtle rituals of military assessment, adjusting posture for optimal alertness, scanning the room for potential advantages, mentally cataloging the competition. She observed these behaviors with the analytical eye that had made her valuable in intelligence circles, noting patterns and dynamics that others might miss. To her left sat Staff Sergeant Tony Blackwood, a former Marine raider whose thick forearms bore faded tattoos from 3 deployments to Syria. His handshake had been firm but brief when they'd been introduced outside, his eyes measuring her with the same intensity he'd once used to evaluate potential threats in urban combat zones. Everything about his bearing suggested a man accustomed to trusting his life to the people beside him, a trust that required proof before it was granted. On her right, Sergeant First Class Michael Kane shifted slightly in his chair, the fabric of his uniform stretching over shoulders built through years of carrying heavy equipment across hostile terrain. A former Army Ranger with 2 Bronze Stars, Kane had the weathered look of someone who'd learned leadership through trial and fire. When he'd glanced at Cindy's file during the morning roster review, his expression had remained carefully neutral, though she'd caught the slight pause that suggested surprise. The conversations flowing around her revealed the intricate web of military networks that connected elite units across service branches. These men knew each other by reputation, if not personally. Shared instructors, overlapping deployments, mutual contacts who vouched for capabilities under extreme stress. They spoke in the abbreviated language of professionals, references to operations and training schools that formed a common vocabulary of excellence. "Remember Jackson from Benning?" Blackwood was saying to the candidate behind him. "He washed out of selection last cycle, made it to week 4 before they pulled him." "No kidding," came the reply. "I heard week 4 was where they separate the real operators from the pretenders. Stress inoculation, they call it." Such exchanges established both camaraderie and subtle competition, each man positioning himself within the hierarchy while gathering intelligence about what lay ahead. The shared understanding of military culture created bonds that Cindy, despite her years of service, couldn't fully access. Her experience had been different, analytical rather than operational, strategic rather than tactical, cerebral rather than physical. Major Derek Harrison entered the briefing room with the measured stride of a career special operations officer. His uniform bore no insignia beyond rank and name tape, but his presence commanded immediate attention. Conversations ceased as candidates straightened in their chairs, recognizing authority earned through competence rather than appointed through bureaucracy. Harrison's eyes swept the room with the systematic assessment of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions based on limited information. "Gentlemen," he began, then paused, his gaze finding Cindy in the third row. "And lady, welcome to Delta Force selection." The acknowledgement was professional and correct, yet somehow it emphasized rather than minimized her difference. In a room full of warriors who'd earned their places through identical paths of combat and specialized training, the need to modify standard address highlighted how her presence disrupted established patterns. She felt the weight of 23 sets of eyes, some curious, others skeptical, all measuring her against expectations built over decades of male-dominated operations. Harrison outlined the selection process with military precision, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd survived the crucible himself. "This is not training," he emphasized. "This is evaluation. We don't teach you to be Delta Force operators. We determine if you already possess the qualities we require." He described phases that would test every aspect of their capabilities. Physical endurance that would push bodies beyond normal limits, psychological resilience under conditions designed to break mental resolve, tactical proficiency in scenarios that mimicked real-world operations. The standards were absolute, the failure rate historically brutal. Of every 100 candidates who entered selection, fewer than 10 emerged with the coveted Delta insignia. Your past achievements got you here, Harrison continued, but they guarantee nothing beyond this moment. Rangers, SEALs, Marines. We've seen them all succeed, and we've seen them all fail. Excellence in your previous units was the entry fee. What happens next depends entirely on who you are when everything you think you know about yourself gets stripped away. Cindy absorbed these words with the same focused attention she'd brought to intelligence briefings, understanding that Harrison was describing more than a selection process. He was outlining a transformation. Around her, candidates nodded with the confidence of men who'd already proven themselves under extreme stress. Their body language suggested readiness, even eagerness, for challenges that would validate their self-image as elite warriors. Captain Jake Morrison took over the briefing, his tone shifting to logistical details that would govern their immediate future. Personal gear requirements, daily schedules, communication protocols, the administrative framework that would structure their next several weeks. His delivery was efficient and comprehensive, leaving no room for misunderstanding about expectations or procedures. Questions? Morrison asked, scanning the room with practiced efficiency. A hand went up in the front row. Sir, what's the policy on candidates supporting each other during selection? There is no policy, Morrison replied. How you interact with fellow candidates, whether you choose cooperation or competition, is part of what we're evaluating. Real operations don't come with instruction manuals for teamwork. We need to see how you naturally respond when thrown together with strangers under pressure. Another question came from the back. What about equipment failure scenarios? Expect them. Equipment fails, intelligence proves wrong, plans go sideways. We need operators who can adapt, not just soldiers who can follow orders. Morrison's answers revealed the philosophical foundation of Delta Force selection. They weren't seeking perfect soldiers, but adaptable warriors capable of independent thought under extreme stress. When no more hands appeared, Morrison moved to individual assignments. Each candidate will receive a personnel liaison from our permanent staff. These officers will handle administrative issues, provide clarification on procedures, and serve as your primary point of contact throughout selection. He began reading names and assignments, pairing candidates with staff members based on criteria that weren't immediately apparent. Blackwood, Staff Sergeant Chen, Kane, Lieutenant Colonel Davis, Patterson, Major Williams. The assignments continued, each pairing revealing the careful thought that went into managing the selection process. Senior candidates were matched with experienced staff, specialists were paired with instructors from relevant fields, geographic assignments were made to optimize logistical efficiency. Fowler, Sergeant First Class Lopez. Cindy noted the assignment without visible reaction, though she was aware of the subtle dynamics at play. Sergeant First Class Elena Lopez was one of only 3 female staff members visible in the briefing room, her presence as rare as Cindy's own. Whether this pairing was coincidental or intentional, it sent a message about how her participation was being managed. After assignments were complete, Morrison dismissed the group with instructions to report to individual stations for initial processing. The room filled with the controlled movement of soldiers transitioning between tasks, conversations resuming as candidates compared assignments and shared speculation about what lay ahead. Cindy gathered her materials and prepared to locate Sergeant Lopez, aware that her first official interaction would likely set the tone for how staff perceived her throughout selection. Around her, candidates were forming the preliminary social bonds that might prove crucial in the weeks ahead. Tactical partnerships based on complementary skills, support networks built on shared experience, competitive relationships that would drive mutual improvement. She moved through these developing dynamics with careful observation, understanding that her role as the lone female candidate would inevitably affect group chemistry. Some might see her as a liability, others as a diversity requirement to be tolerated, still others as an unknown factor that could disrupt established patterns of masculine cooperation. Her challenge would be establishing credibility, not through the combat credentials she lacked, but through the demonstration of capabilities that others hadn't yet recognized. As candidates filed out of the briefing room toward their individual assignments, the real selection process was already beginning. First impressions were being formed, alliances were being considered, and the complex social dynamics that would influence performance under stress were starting to crystallize. For Cindy Fowler, the next few hours would determine whether she'd be accepted as a legitimate competitor or dismissed as an administrative anomaly in a world built for warriors. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting sharper shadows across the Delta Force compound as 24 individuals began their transformation from accomplished soldiers into something far more exclusive, or their journey toward discovering that excellence in one arena didn't guarantee success in another. Sergeant First Class Elena Lopez stood beside her desk in Building C, reviewing candidate files with the methodical attention of someone who'd seen dozens of promising soldiers crack under pressure. Her office occupied a narrow space between the main corridor and a conference room, its walls lined with training manuals and evaluation forms that documented the systematic dismantling of military egos. She'd been conducting these initial assessments for 3 years, and the patterns were always the same: confident arrivals, gradual reality checks, and the inevitable separation of genuine capability from inflated reputation. When Cindy knocked on the doorframe, Lopez looked up from her paperwork with professional curiosity. The administrative photograph in the file hadn't captured the quiet intensity in Cindy's eyes, nor the way she carried herself with careful precision, rather than the aggressive confidence typical of special operations candidates. Everything about her demeanor suggested someone accustomed to being evaluated, measured, and found wanting by people who couldn't see past surface appearances. "Ms. Fowler," Lopez said, gesturing toward the chair across from her desk, "let's get your processing started." The initial paperwork was routine: emergency contacts, medical history updates, security clearance verifications. But as they worked through the forms, Lopez found herself asking questions that went beyond standard protocol. Cindy's responses were precise and thoughtful, revealing an analytical mind that approached problems systematically rather than relying on intuition or bravado. "Your motivation statement mentions expanding operational capabilities," Lopez noted, reading from Cindy's application. "That's unusual phrasing. Most candidates talk about serving their country or testing their limits." Cindy considered her response carefully. Special operations face increasingly complex challenges that require diverse skill sets. Traditional approaches work until they don't, and then you need people who can think differently about problems. It was a diplomatic answer that revealed more than it concealed. Someone who understood that her value lay not in matching existing templates, but in offering perspectives that others couldn't provide. Lopez made a note in the file, recognizing the kind of thoughtful self-awareness that often masked exceptional capabilities. Meanwhile, in the main corridor, conversations among candidates had taken on the subtle competitive edge that always emerged during initial processing. Groups formed naturally around shared experiences. Rangers gravitating toward other Rangers, Navy personnel finding common ground in maritime operations, Marines bonding over the aggressive culture that defined their service. These informal alliances served multiple purposes: information sharing, psychological support, and tactical networking for the challenges ahead. Staff Sergeant Tony Blackwood emerged from his meeting with Staff Sergeant Chen carrying a thick packet of training materials and a schedule that would govern his next 2 weeks. His expression was focused but confident. He'd received the kind of detailed briefing that validated his expectations about Delta Force professionalism. The standards were high, the requirements specific, but everything aligned with his understanding of elite military operations. "How'd it go?" asked Sergeant First Class Michael Kane, who was waiting for his own appointment. "Straightforward," Blackwood replied. "They know what they want, and they're not interested in games. Physical standards are exactly what we expected. Psychological evaluation is comprehensive but fair. If you can hack it, they'll know. If you can't, they'll find out quickly." Kane nodded, understanding the subtext. Delta Force selection had a reputation for brutal efficiency. No artificial barriers or arbitrary requirements, just objective measurement of capabilities under stress. For experienced operators who'd already proven themselves in combat, the prospect was both intimidating and appealing. Other candidates shared similar assessments as they completed their individual meetings. The consensus was emerging that selection would be demanding but predictable, following patterns established over decades of identifying exceptional soldiers. The psychological profiles, physical requirements, and tactical evaluations all fell within expected parameters for special operations forces. But whispers of a different sort were beginning to circulate. "Did you see who got paired with Lopez?" someone mentioned during a break between appointments. "Makes sense," came the reply. "Probably need someone to handle the special considerations." The comments weren't overtly hostile, but they carried assumptions that were harder to combat than direct criticism. The suggestion that Cindy required special considerations implied that her participation was somehow different from the standard evaluation process, that accommodation rather than merit had brought her to this point. Captain Jake Morrison noticed these undercurrents during his routine circulation through the processing areas. In his experience, group dynamics during initial phases often predicted performance under stress later in selection. Candidates who felt threatened or diminished by others' presence typically struggled when cooperation became essential for mission success. The subtle exclusion of outliers could undermine unit cohesion before teams were even formed. He paused outside Lopez's office, ostensibly reviewing his clipboard, but actually observing the interaction between sergeant and candidate. Through the partially open door, he could see Cindy answering questions with calm professionalism, while Lopez took notes with obvious engagement. The exchange looked like every other initial assessment, yet Morrison knew it was being conducted under different assumptions about likely outcomes. In the equipment bay, candidates were receiving their initial gear assignments, standardized loadouts that would ensure equal starting conditions for physical evaluations. The process revealed another layer of subtle differentiation, as each candidate's familiarity with various systems became apparent through their handling and inspection routines. Blackwood examined his assigned rifle with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd maintained weapons under combat conditions. His movements were automatic: chamber check, action cycling, sight alignment verification, performed with the muscle memory that came from years of treating equipment as extensions of his own body. Around him, other candidates demonstrated similar expertise, their confidence built on extensive experience with the tools of their trade. When Cindy's turn came, she approached the equipment with careful attention rather than casual familiarity. She handled each item systematically, checking function and fit with methodical precision, but her movements lacked the automatic fluidity that marked lifetime warriors. The difference was subtle but noticeable to experienced observers. She was competent but not instinctive, knowledgeable but not intimate with the equipment. "First time with the 416?" asked the equipment sergeant, noting her careful inspection of the assigned rifle. "I've trained on similar platforms," Cindy replied, "but not extensively. I'm more familiar with the analytical side of weapons systems." Her honesty was refreshing in an environment where many candidates might have overstated their experience, but it also confirmed suspicions about her background. While others treated weapons as familiar tools, she approached them as complex systems to be understood through study rather than experience. The distinction mattered in a community that valued intuitive expertise, born from repeated exposure to life-and-death situations. The afternoon brought the first group assembly since the initial briefing, a formation designed to establish baseline physical standards and observation protocols. 24 candidates arranged themselves in precise ranks on the main parade ground, their uniforms and equipment creating the visual uniformity that masked wide variations in background and capability. Major Harrison addressed them from a small platform, his voice carrying easily across the formation despite the afternoon wind that had begun stirring dust devils in the distance. "Physical fitness is the foundation of everything we do," he announced. "Not because we're gym rats, but because operations don't pause for personal limitations. When your teammates depend on you, being tired isn't an option." He outlined the fitness evaluation that would begin the next morning, a comprehensive assessment that would measure not just strength and endurance, but the ability to maintain performance under cumulative stress. The standards were specific and unforgiving, designed to identify candidates whose physical capabilities would support rather than limit operational effectiveness. "Questions about the evaluation criteria?" Harrison asked. A hand went up in the second rank. "Sir, are there different standards for different candidates?" The question hung in the air with obvious implications. Though it was phrased with careful neutrality, Harrison's response was equally measured. "Every candidate meets the same standards, period. We don't adjust requirements based on demographics, background, or political considerations. The enemy doesn't offer accommodations, and neither do we." His answer satisfied those seeking assurance that selection would remain merit-based, but it also established the framework within which Cindy's performance would be evaluated. She would face the same physical demands as former Rangers and Navy SEALs, with no consideration given to the different training focus that had characterized her military career. As the formation dispersed, candidates moved toward their assigned quarters for the evening. Conversations continued the themes that had emerged throughout the day. Speculation about evaluation criteria, sharing of preparation strategies, and the gradual formation of alliances based on mutual assessment of capabilities and compatibility. Cindy walked alone toward her assigned building, carrying her gear with the same careful precision she'd demonstrated all day. Behind her, groups of candidates continued their networking, building the social bonds that would influence performance in team-based evaluations. She was beginning to understand that her challenge went beyond meeting physical standards or demonstrating tactical knowledge. She would need to earn acceptance from peers who measured worth through combat credentials she didn't possess. The evening sun cast long shadows across the Delta Force compound as 24 candidates prepared for their first night of what would either be the most challenging experience of their military careers or their final attempt to join America's most elite warriors. For Cindy Fowler, the subtle dismissals and careful exclusions of the first day had established the battlefield on which she would need to prove not just her capabilities, but her right to be tested alongside the best soldiers her country could produce. Tomorrow would bring the first objective measurements of their physical and mental qualities, but tonight, assumptions were crystallizing that might prove harder to overcome than any fitness standard or tactical evaluation. The pre-dawn darkness at Fort Bragg carried the crisp bite of autumn air as 24 candidates assembled for their first physical evaluation. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across the obstacle course, illuminating metal structures that had broken countless soldiers who thought they were ready for Delta Force. The course stretched across nearly 2 miles of unforgiving terrain, each section designed to test different aspects of physical and mental resilience under conditions that mimicked operational stress. Instructor Sergeant Major Rick Donovan stood at the starting line, his presence commanding immediate attention despite the early hour. 3 decades of special operations had carved deep lines around his eyes and left his voice gravelly from years of shouting orders in hostile environments. He'd overseen thousands of evaluations, watching elite soldiers discover the difference between being good at their jobs and being exceptional at impossible tasks. "This isn't a race," Donovan announced, his voice cutting through the morning stillness. "Speed without precision is worthless. We're measuring your ability to maintain performance standards when your body wants to quit, and your mind starts making excuses." The first obstacle was deceptively simple, a rope climb that reached 40 feet into the darkness above. For experienced soldiers, it should have been routine. But Donovan had positioned it immediately after a half-mile sprint across uneven terrain, ensuring that candidates would approach the challenge with elevated heart rates and depleted grip strength. The rope itself was deliberately weathered, its fibers rough enough to tear unprotected hands and slick enough to punish inadequate technique. Staff Sergeant Tony Blackwood attacked the course with the aggressive confidence that had served him through 3 combat deployments. His sprint was controlled but fast, his breathing regulated through techniques learned in Marine Raider training. When he reached the rope, his ascent was powerful and efficient, each movement economical and purposeful. He cleared the top in under 90 seconds, dropped to the ground with practiced absorption, and continued toward the next obstacle without pause. Sergeant First Class Michael Kane followed a similar pattern, his Ranger training evident in the systematic way he approached each challenge. His movements were precise rather than dramatic, conserving energy for the long evaluation ahead while maintaining the pace necessary to meet time standards. Other candidates demonstrated comparable competence, their performance reflecting years of specialized training and combat experience. Then came Cindy's turn. She approached the sprint with measured pacing, her stride efficient but lacking the explosive power that characterized the others' movement. Her breathing remained controlled, but observers could see the effort required to maintain speed across terrain that seemed to pose less challenge to her competitors. When she reached the rope, her technique was textbook correct. Proper grip, efficient foot positioning, steady rhythm. But her ascent was noticeably slower than those who had preceded her. "Come on, analyst," someone called out from the group waiting behind her. "The computer won't climb itself." Scattered chuckles followed the comment, quiet enough to avoid official notice but loud enough to carry across the starting area. Cindy completed the climb without acknowledging the distraction, but her descent revealed the strain that the effort had required. Her hands showed early signs of rope burn despite her gloves, and her landing was less controlled than those of candidates with extensive obstacle training. Captain Jake Morrison observed from the instructor platform, making notes on his evaluation clipboard. The physical performance was within acceptable parameters, not exceptional, but adequate for progression to the next phase. What concerned him more were the group dynamics developing around Cindy's participation. Elite units required absolute trust among team members, and the subtle mockery beginning to emerge suggested problems that could compromise operational effectiveness. The obstacles that followed revealed the growing disparity between Cindy's capabilities and those of her competitors. The tire drag required moving a 200-pound weight across 50 meters of sand, a test of raw strength and determination that favored candidates with extensive weight training backgrounds. Cindy completed the challenge, but her technique was obviously labored compared to the explosive power demonstrated by former infantry soldiers. "She's going to hurt herself," Blackwood muttered to Kane during a water break. "This isn't about being supportive. Someone's going to have to carry her weight when this gets real." Kane nodded, though his expression was more concerned than dismissive. "I've seen good soldiers burn out trying to keep up with standards they weren't prepared for. Command should have screened better before letting her get this far." Their conversation was overheard by several other candidates, reinforcing the narrative that Cindy's presence represented a departure from normal selection standards. The implication was clear. She was being held to different expectations, either because of political pressure or administrative oversight that had allowed an unqualified candidate into an elite selection process. The psychological impact was exactly what Instructor Donovan had intended, though not in the way he'd planned. His course was designed to reveal character under stress, identifying candidates who would persevere through adversity and maintain unit cohesion when operations went sideways. Instead, it was creating divisions based on assumptions about capability and belonging. The wall climb presented the day's most technically demanding challenge, a 30-foot vertical surface with minimal hand and footholds, requiring upper body strength, technique, and mental resilience to overcome the fear of heights while exhausted from previous obstacles. For candidates with extensive climbing experience, it was manageable though demanding. For those who'd focused their training on other specialties, it represented a significant test of adaptability. Cindy approached the wall after watching others demonstrate various techniques, some successful, others requiring multiple attempts. She studied the route options with analytical precision, noting which hand positions had worked for different body types and climbing styles. When her turn came, she began her ascent with careful deliberation, testing each hold before committing her weight. Halfway up, her progress slowed noticeably. The accumulated fatigue from previous obstacles was taking its toll, and her grip strength was failing faster than those of candidates with extensive rock climbing backgrounds. She paused at a difficult transition, breathing heavily while calculating her next moves. "Just drop down," called out Sergeant Thompson from below. "Save yourself the embarrassment." "Clock's running," added another voice. "You're burning time for everyone behind you." The comments weren't officially discouraging. Candidates were allowed to encourage or advise each other as part of the evaluation process. But the tone carried mockery disguised as practical advice, designed to undermine confidence rather than provide genuine support. Cindy continued upward, her movements becoming more tentative as exhaustion mounted. Her technique remained sound, but the execution was increasingly labored. When she finally reached the top, the effort had clearly pushed her to her physical limits. Her descent was careful but shaky, and when she dropped the final few feet to the ground, she needed a moment to steady herself before moving toward the next obstacle. Major Derek Harrison watched from the command vehicle, monitoring both individual performance and group dynamics through radio reports from positioned observers. The physical evaluation was proceeding normally, some candidates excelling, others struggling, all being pushed to reveal their true capabilities under stress. But the social dynamics were developing in ways that could undermine the selection process itself. "Sir," came a voice through his radio headset, "we're seeing some concerning behavior around candidate Fowler. Nothing that violates conduct standards, but the group dynamic is becoming divisive." Harrison understood the implications immediately. Delta Force operations required seamless teamwork under extreme stress. Candidates who couldn't trust and support each other during selection were unlikely to function effectively in combat situations where lives depended on unit cohesion. The final obstacle of the morning was a combat simulation that required candidates to low-crawl under wire obstacles while carrying a weighted pack, simulating movement through hostile territory under fire. The challenge tested not just physical endurance, but the mental resilience to maintain tactical discipline when exhausted and stressed. Most candidates approached the exercise with grim determination, understanding that this was where technical skill mattered as much as physical strength. Proper technique could minimize energy expenditure and reduce exposure time, while poor form would result in exhaustion and potentially dangerous entanglement in the overhead wires. Cindy began the crawl with systematic precision, her movements careful and controlled. But the accumulated fatigue from the morning's challenges was evident in every meter of progress. What should have been a demonstration of tactical proficiency became a grinding test of sheer willpower as she forced her body to continue when every muscle fiber screamed for rest. Behind her, candidates were stacking up as her slow progress created a bottleneck in the exercise flow. The delay wasn't technically a violation. Each candidate was entitled to complete the course at their own pace as long as they met minimum time standards. But the practical effect was to make her struggle visible to everyone waiting, turning personal challenge into public spectacle. "This is painful to watch," someone commented, the words carrying clearly in the morning air. "Command's gonna have to pull her soon," came the reply. "She's not built for this level of intensity." The comments weren't directed at Cindy, but they were spoken loudly enough to ensure she could hear them. The psychological pressure was mounting with each obstacle, creating stress that went beyond the physical challenges that the course was designed to impose. When she finally completed the combat crawl, emerging from under the wire with dirt-stained uniform and obvious exhaustion, the scattered applause was polite but perfunctory. No one questioned her determination or effort, but the unspoken consensus was clear. She was operating beyond her natural capabilities, pushing through obstacles that others navigated with relative ease. As candidates moved toward the final checkpoint for morning evaluation, the social divisions that had emerged during the physical testing were crystallizing into assumptions that would be harder to overcome than any fitness standard. Cindy had completed every obstacle, meeting the minimum requirements for advancement to the next phase, but her struggle had been witnessed by 23 soldiers who measured competence through the lens of their own superior performance. The morning sun had climbed higher, burning off the early darkness and revealing the full scope of the Delta Force training complex. For most candidates, the physical evaluation had been a successful demonstration of their readiness for the challenges ahead. For Cindy Fowler, it had become the first public confirmation of what many had already suspected, that her presence in Delta Force selection represented a departure from normal standards that could compromise the integrity of America's most elite military unit. The real test, however, was just beginning. The afternoon tactical evaluation took place in Building D's War Room, a sterile environment designed to simulate the high-pressure decision-making that defines special operations planning. 24 computer stations arranged in a horseshoe configuration faced a massive display screen showing satellite imagery of a fictional target compound. The scenario was complex but realistic, a hostage rescue mission in hostile territory that would test each candidate's ability to analyze intelligence, develop tactical solutions, and present actionable plans under time pressure. Instructor Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell had designed this particular exercise to reveal how candidates processed information when multiple variables created competing priorities. A former intelligence officer herself, she understood that modern special operations required analytical thinking as much as physical prowess. The days when elite soldiers could rely solely on courage and marksmanship were long past. Today's missions demanded comprehensive understanding of complex operational environments. "You have 45 minutes to analyze the intelligence package and develop a complete mission profile," Mitchell announced to the assembled candidates. "Your presentation will be recorded and evaluated for tactical soundness, risk assessment, and operational feasibility. Questions will be technical and specific. Vague answers will be noted accordingly." The intelligence package was deliberately overwhelming. Satellite photos, intercepted communications, architectural blueprints, personnel files, weather reports, and equipment manifests that collectively painted a detailed picture of the target environment. For candidates accustomed to receiving pre-processed briefings from intelligence specialists, the raw data dump represented a significant analytical challenge. Staff Sergeant Tony Blackwood opened his packet and immediately began organizing the materials by category, his approach systematic but focused primarily on tactical elements that would affect assault planning. His background in direct action operations provided a framework for understanding the mission, but the intelligence analysis required skills outside his primary expertise. Sergeant First Class Michael Kane took a different approach, starting with the personnel files to understand the human elements that might influence mission execution. His Ranger experience had taught him that successful operations depended as much on understanding enemy psychology as terrain features. But the depth of analysis required exceeded what his training had emphasized. Around the room, candidates attacked the problem with varying strategies that reflected their different backgrounds and areas of expertise. Some focused on tactical planning, others on logistical considerations, still others on risk mitigation. Each approach revealed both strengths and limitations, as elite soldiers discovered that excellence in one domain didn't automatically translate to competence in others. Cindy approached the intelligence package with methodical precision, her years of analytical training immediately apparent in how she processed the disparate information sources. While others struggled to synthesize satellite imagery with communication intercepts, she moved fluidly between different data types, building a comprehensive understanding of the operational environment that went beyond simple tactical considerations. Her computer screen filled with detailed notes as she cross-referenced personnel movements with architectural vulnerabilities, identified patterns in communication traffic that suggested operational timing, and calculated risk factors that balanced mission success against casualty probabilities. The analytical framework she'd developed through years of intelligence work allowed her to see connections that others missed. Time check. 30 minutes remaining, Mitchell announced. Stress levels in the room were becoming visible as candidates realized the complexity of translating raw intelligence into actionable military plans. Some had fallen behind in their analysis, focusing too narrowly on familiar elements while missing broader strategic considerations. Others had become overwhelmed by the volume of information, struggling to prioritize essential elements for mission planning. Blackwood glanced around the room, noting who appeared confident and who seemed to be struggling with the analytical demands. His own plan was taking shape, but he could see gaps in his intelligence assessment that more experienced analysts might have filled. When his eyes reached Cindy's station, however, he paused with surprise. Her screen displayed a mission profile of remarkable sophistication: detailed timeline analysis, comprehensive threat assessment, alternative plan development, and risk mitigation strategies that addressed contingencies he hadn't even considered. The quality of her work was immediately apparent to anyone with tactical planning experience, revealing analytical capabilities that far exceeded what her background had suggested. Kane noticed the same thing from his position 2 rows back. Cindy's presentation materials were organizing themselves into a professional intelligence briefing that demonstrated mastery of complex analytical processes. Her approach wasn't just competent, it was exemplary, showing the kind of detailed operational planning that typically required teams of specialized staff officers. 15 minutes, Mitchell called out. The time pressure was revealing different responses to stress among the candidates. Some were rushing to complete their presentations, sacrificing thoroughness for speed. Others were becoming increasingly frustrated as they realized their analytical skills weren't matching the demands of the exercise. A few had settled into focused concentration, working steadily through their materials with practiced efficiency. Cindy's presentation was nearing completion, her mission profile comprehensive enough to serve as an actual operational plan. She'd identified vulnerabilities that others had missed, developed contingencies for scenarios that hadn't occurred to most candidates, and created a tactical approach that balanced aggression with prudent risk management. Her years of supporting special operations from the intelligence side had given her insights that direct action specialists couldn't match. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. Time, Mitchell announced. Save your work and prepare for presentations. Individual presentation slots were assigned randomly, ensuring that candidates couldn't benefit from hearing others' analyses before presenting their own. The format was deliberately stressful. Each candidate would brief their mission plan to the entire group while being questioned by instructors who knew the intelligence package intimately. Sergeant Peterson went first, delivering a competent but basic tactical plan that addressed the essential mission elements without much sophistication. His briefing was clear but shallow, missing operational complexities that more detailed analysis would have revealed. The instructor questions exposed these gaps quickly, highlighting areas where deeper thinking was required. Thompson followed with a more aggressive approach that emphasized speed and overwhelming force. His plan was tactically sound, but showed limited consideration for the political complexities that the intelligence package had suggested. When questioned about civilian casualty risks and diplomatic implications, his responses revealed the narrow focus typical of direct action specialists. Kane's presentation demonstrated solid tactical thinking with better attention to risk factors and contingency planning. His Ranger background showed in the methodical approach to mission execution, though his intelligence analysis lacked the depth that specialists might have provided. The instructor's questions were more challenging, probing areas where his planning needed refinement. Blackwood delivered a confident briefing that reflected his Marine raider experience with complex operations. His plan was aggressive but well-reasoned, showing good understanding of tactical priorities and operational sequencing. However, when questioned about intelligence gaps and assumption validation, his responses revealed the limitations of his analytical training. Other candidates presented variations on similar themes, tactically competent plans that reflected their combat experience but showed limited sophistication in intelligence analysis and operational planning. The pattern was consistent. These were warriors who understood fighting but struggled with the comprehensive analysis that modern special operations demanded. Then came Cindy's turn. She approached the presentation podium with the same quiet confidence she'd maintained throughout selection, her materials organized with professional precision. When she began speaking, however, the change in atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. The intelligence package reveals a target environment with 3 distinct operational phases. She began, her voice clear and authoritative. Pre-assault intelligence suggests a coordinated timing window that aligns with shift changes in both security personnel and civilian support staff. Her presentation unfolded with methodical precision, each element building on detailed analysis that demonstrated mastery of intelligence interpretation. She identified patterns in communication traffic that suggested enemy awareness of potential threats, architectural vulnerabilities that could be exploited for tactical advantage, and timing considerations that would minimize both mission risk and civilian casualties. The questions from instructors became increasingly technical as they probed the depth of her analysis. Her responses were comprehensive and confident, revealing knowledge of operational planning that exceeded what most direct action specialists possessed. She'd identified intelligence gaps that others had missed, developed contingencies for scenarios that hadn't occurred to tactical planners, and created risk assessments that balanced mission success against broader strategic considerations. "What's your assessment of enemy counterintelligence capabilities?" Mitchell asked, testing knowledge that typically required specialized training. "Communication patterns suggest compartmented information flow consistent with professional security protocols," Cindy replied without hesitation. "The timing delays between facility movements and external communications indicate either operational security awareness or active counter-surveillance measures. My recommendation would be to assume the latter and plan accordingly." The silence in the room had weight. Candidates who'd dismissed her physical performance were witnessing analytical capabilities that surpassed their own by significant margins. The woman they'd assumed was operating beyond her competence was demonstrating expertise that made their own efforts appear amateurish by comparison. Major Derek Harrison observed from the back of the room, his expression carefully neutral as he watched the group dynamics shift in real time. The tactical evaluation was revealing capabilities that physical testing couldn't measure, and the implications were forcing everyone present to reconsider their assumptions about what made an effective special operations candidate. As Cindy concluded her presentation and returned to her seat, the atmosphere in the war room had fundamentally changed. The easy dismissals and casual mockery of the morning were replaced by uncertain silence, as 23 elite soldiers grappled with the possibility that they'd been wrong about more than just her physical capabilities. The real test was just beginning. The classified briefing room buzzed with nervous energy as candidates assembled for what Major Harrison had cryptically described as their practical application evaluation. Unlike previous assessments conducted in controlled environments, today's challenge would take place at the Nevada test site, a sprawling complex of military training facilities where elite units practiced operations too sensitive for standard bases. The transport flight to Nevada had been conducted in silence, candidates restricted from discussing the mission parameters during the 3-hour journey aboard a converted military cargo aircraft. Through small windows, they'd watched the landscape change from the green forests of North Carolina to the harsh desert terrain that would serve as their testing ground. The isolation was complete and intentional. Whatever they were about to face would occur far from observation or interference. Colonel Patricia Vance stood before the assembled group with the bearing of someone who'd spent 30 years managing operations that didn't officially exist. Her uniform bore no unit insignia beyond rank and name tape, but her presence commanded immediate respect from soldiers who recognized authentic authority regardless of visible credentials. Behind her, a large display screen showed satellite imagery of a compound that looked more like a fortress than a training facility. "What you're about to see is classified at levels that exceed most of your current clearances," Vance announced, her voice carrying across the silent room. "The information I'm sharing exists solely for the purpose of this evaluation and will not be discussed outside this facility." She activated the display system, revealing detailed imagery of a target complex that immediately captured every candidate's attention. The compound was unlike anything they'd encountered in standard military training. A sophisticated facility with multiple security layers, advanced detection systems, and defensive measures that seemed designed to defeat conventional infiltration attempts. "This is designated Target Complex 7, Vance continued. "It represents the most challenging penetration scenario our intelligence agencies have developed. The facility incorporates every defensive technology and tactical countermeasure that hostile forces might employ against special operations infiltration." The statistics she provided were sobering. Over the past 18 months, 12 different special operations teams had attempted to breach the compound's defenses. Every single attempt had failed, with detection times ranging from 43 minutes to less than 8 minutes after infiltration began. The facility had earned a reputation among elite units as an impossible target, theoretically vulnerable but practically impenetrable. Staff Sergeant Tony Blackwood studied the imagery with growing unease, recognizing defensive systems that would challenge even the most experienced infiltration specialists. Motion sensors, thermal detection, acoustic monitoring, and human security patrols created overlapping coverage that seemed to eliminate any possibility of undetected approach. His Marine Raider training had prepared him for complex penetration missions, but nothing approaching this level of defensive sophistication. Sergeant First Class Michael Kane was equally troubled by what he was seeing. The compound's design incorporated lessons learned from decades of special operations, creating a defensive environment that specifically countered the techniques that elite units relied upon for infiltration success. Every traditional approach he could envision would be detected and neutralized before reaching the primary target area. Around the room, other candidates were reaching similar conclusions. The facility represented a quantum leap beyond anything they'd trained against, incorporating defensive technologies that seemed designed specifically to defeat special operations capabilities. The 12 previous failures weren't surprising. They were inevitable given the level of protection the compound provided. "Your mission," Vance announced, "is to successfully infiltrate Target Complex 7 and retrieve a specific intelligence package from the central facility without triggering any security alerts. You will have 72 hours to plan and execute your approach." The challenge was unprecedented in Delta Force selection history. Previous evaluations had tested physical capabilities, tactical knowledge, and analytical thinking through controlled exercises with known parameters. This mission demanded real-world problem-solving against defenses that had already proven effective against elite military units. "Sir," Candidate Stevens raised his hand hesitantly, "will this be a team effort or individual assessment?" "Individual," Vance replied. "Each candidate will develop and execute their own infiltration plan. Success or failure will be measured individually, though we recognize that this target has defeated teams of operators working in coordination." The implications were staggering. If teams of experienced special operations soldiers had failed against these defenses, the probability of individual success seemed virtually non-existent. The evaluation appeared designed not to identify exceptional operators but to demonstrate the limitations of conventional special operations thinking. Captain Jake Morrison understood the strategic purpose behind the evaluation even if the candidates didn't. Modern threats increasingly involve targets that traditional military approaches couldn't address, facilities protected by defensive systems that evolved faster than special operations tactics could adapt. The military needed operators who could think beyond established doctrine when conventional methods proved inadequate. The planning phase began immediately, with candidates receiving detailed intelligence packages about the target compound's defensive systems, security protocols, and physical layout. The information was comprehensive but overwhelming, requiring synthesis of technical data across multiple specialties that exceeded most candidates' educational backgrounds. Blackwood approached the problem with systematic methodology, identifying potential infiltration routes and matching them against known defensive capabilities. His analysis was thorough and professionally competent, but each approach he developed encountered defensive measures that would likely result in detection. The compound seemed designed to counter exactly the kind of thinking that special operations training emphasized. Kane focused on timing and coordination, looking for patterns in security coverage that might create brief windows of vulnerability. His Ranger experience had taught him to exploit enemy weaknesses through careful observation and patient timing, but the defensive systems appeared to have been designed with such tactics in mind. Every potential advantage he identified was countered by redundant protection. Other candidates struggled with similar problems, their conventional military training providing frameworks that proved inadequate for the challenge they faced. The facility represented a new category of target that required thinking beyond established special operations doctrine, demanding innovation rather than execution of proven techniques. Cindy approached the intelligence package with different analytical frameworks, her background in defensive system design providing perspectives that purely operational experience couldn't match. While others focused on defeating individual defensive elements, she studied the integrated architecture that coordinated multiple protection systems into a comprehensive security environment. Her analysis revealed patterns that escaped traditional tactical thinking, coordination protocols between different sensors that created brief gaps in coverage, power distribution systems that prioritized certain defensive elements over others during high-demand periods, and communication networks that could potentially be exploited through electronic warfare techniques that most special operations units didn't employ. Interesting approach, observed Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, who was monitoring candidate planning sessions through discrete observation. Cindy's methodology was unlike anything she'd seen from previous selection cycles, incorporating technical knowledge that seemed to come from direct experience with the defensive system she was analyzing. The first candidate presentations began that evening, with each operator briefing their infiltration plan to a panel of senior instructors. The pattern was depressingly consistent, professionally competent approaches that would inevitably fail against the compound's sophisticated defenses. Even the most creative tactical thinking couldn't overcome the fundamental reality that conventional infiltration techniques were insufficient for this level of target. Blackwood's presentation was typical of the group's efforts, a well-reasoned plan that acknowledged the defensive challenges while proposing solutions based on exceptional execution of standard techniques. His approach might have succeeded against conventional targets, but the instructors' questions quickly revealed weaknesses that the compound systems would exploit. Kane's briefing demonstrated similar competence and similar limitations, his timing-based approach failing to account for defensive adaptations that would recognize and counter patient reconnaissance. His plan was tactically sound but strategically inadequate for a target designed to defeat exactly such methodical approaches. Other presentations followed the same pattern, each candidate demonstrating mastery of special operations principles while failing to develop solutions adequate for the unprecedented challenge they faced. The evaluation was revealing the limitations of conventional military thinking when confronted with defensive systems that had evolved beyond traditional countermeasures. When Cindy's turn came, the atmosphere in the briefing room had grown subdued. 18 candidates had presented infiltration plans that the instructors had systematically demolished through technical questioning, revealing fundamental flaws that would result in mission failure. The target seemed genuinely impossible, protected by defenses that exceeded the capability of individual operators regardless of their skill level. Her presentation began differently from the others, focusing not on tactical approaches but on systemic vulnerabilities that existed within the defensive architecture itself. Rather than trying to defeat individual sensors or avoid specific security measures, she'd identified ways to exploit the coordination protocols that integrated different protective systems. The compound's defensive strength comes from system integration, she explained, her briefing displaying technical diagrams that showed defensive coordination pathways. But integration creates dependencies that can be exploited if you understand the underlying architecture. Her plan was unlike anything the instructors had heard in previous selection cycles, incorporating techniques from electronic warfare, system exploitation, and defensive system design that went far beyond conventional special operations training. She wasn't proposing to sneak past the defenses. She was suggesting ways to make the defenses work against themselves. The questions that followed revealed the depth of her technical knowledge, her responses demonstrating familiarity with defensive systems that suggested direct experience with their design and implementation. When Colonel Vance asked about specific countermeasures that classified systems might employ, Cindy's answers were precise and detailed, indicating access to information that few special operations officers possessed. As her presentation concluded, the silence in the briefing room had a different quality than the disappointed quiet that had followed previous failures. For the first time since the evaluation began, someone had proposed an approach that might actually succeed against Target Complex 7's defenses. The real test would come tomorrow, when theory would meet reality in the Nevada desert. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars as Cindy Fowler approached Target Complex 7 through coordinates that her analysis had identified as the single point of maximum defensive vulnerability. While other candidates had attempted their infiltrations during daylight hours with predictable results, she had waited for the optimal window that her systematic study of the facility's operational patterns had revealed. Her equipment was different from what others had carried, not the standard special operations gear that emphasized versatility and firepower, but specialized electronic devices that most Delta Force candidates wouldn't recognize, let alone know how to operate. Each piece had been selected for specific functions related to her unique approach to defeating the compound's integrated defensive systems. The observation bunker 3 miles away buzzed with quiet activity as instructors monitored her approach through thermal imaging and electronic surveillance. Colonel Patricia Vance stood behind the primary monitoring station, her expression unreadable as she watched displays that showed Cindy's progress toward a target that had defeated every previous attempt. "She's moving through Sector 7, reported the technician monitoring ground sensors. That's the approach vector that triggered alerts for the last 4 candidates within 6 minutes. Major Derek Harrison joined Vance at the monitoring station, carrying a classified folder that contained information he'd only been authorized to access after Cindy's presentation the previous evening. The contents had fundamentally altered his understanding of who they were actually evaluating and why her participation in Delta Force selection represented something far more significant than standard candidate assessment. "Tell me what you're seeing," Vance said quietly, her eyes never leaving the displays. "Something impossible," Harrison replied. "She's not just avoiding the sensors. She's manipulating them. Look at the thermal reading patterns. The system is registering her presence but interpreting it as environmental variation rather than human intrusion." On the screens, Cindy moved with deliberate precision through defensive perimeters that had stopped elite special operations teams. But her progress wasn't the result of superior stealth techniques or exceptional physical capabilities. Instead, she was systematically exploiting vulnerabilities in the defensive architecture that required intimate knowledge of how the systems functioned at the most fundamental level. Phase 1 penetration complete, the monitoring technician announced with obvious surprise. "She's reached the intermediate checkpoint without triggering any alerts." The achievement was unprecedented. Previous candidates had been detected and eliminated from the exercise before reaching even the outer defensive ring. Cindy's approach had somehow neutralized multiple layers of sophisticated protection that represented the latest in military defensive technology. In the candidate observation area, 18 remaining soldiers watched the same displays with growing amazement and dawning realization. Staff Sergeant Tony Blackwood stared at the screens in silence, understanding that what they were witnessing went far beyond exceptional performance. It represented capabilities that conventional special operations training couldn't explain. "How is she doing that?" Sergeant First Class Michael Kane asked quietly, his voice carrying the confusion that every observer was feeling. The answer came from an unexpected source. Captain Jake Morrison stepped forward with authorization from Colonel Vance to reveal information that had been classified throughout the selection process. "Because she designed half the systems she's defeating," Morrison announced, his words hitting the observation room like a physical force. The revelation created immediate silence as candidates processed information that reframed everything they thought they knew about Cindy Fowler's background and qualifications. Morrison continued with details that had been restricted until this moment of demonstration. "Candidate Fowler isn't just an intelligence analyst seeking special operations assignment. She's been the lead systems architect for defensive technologies that protect our most sensitive installations worldwide. The consulting work in her file wasn't administrative support. It was classified development of penetration-resistant security systems for facilities that conventional forces can't protect." On the monitoring screens, Cindy had reached the central facility and was accessing the target intelligence package through methods that bypassed every security protocol the compound employed. Her movements showed familiarity with systems that few people outside classified development programs even knew existed. For the past 8 years, Morrison continued, she's been part of a joint task force that develops defensive countermeasures against special operations infiltration. Every technique you've been taught, every approach you've mastered, she's helped design systems specifically intended to defeat those methods. The implications were staggering. The woman they'd dismissed as an unqualified diversity candidate was actually one of the military's leading experts in exactly the kind of advanced operations that Delta Force was evolving to conduct. Her presence in selection wasn't a mistake or accommodation. It was a recruitment effort targeting capabilities that the unit desperately needed. Staff Sergeant Tony Blackwood felt the weight of realization settling over him like cold water. Every dismissive comment, every casual insult, every assumption about her inadequacy had been directed at someone whose expertise exceeded that of the instructors conducting their evaluation. The morning's mockery during physical training seemed petty and ignorant in retrospect. Sergeant First Class Michael Kane was experiencing similar discomfort as he understood that his skepticism about her qualifications had been based on fundamental misunderstanding of what modern special operations actually required. While he'd been perfecting tactics developed decades ago, she'd been creating the technologies that would define warfare in the coming decades. "Mission complete," announced the monitoring technician, his voice carrying amazement that was shared throughout the observation facility. "Package retrieved without triggering any defensive alerts. Total infiltration time, 47 minutes. The achievement was beyond remarkable. It was revolutionary. Target Complex 7 had been designed specifically to defeat special operations infiltration, incorporating every defensive technology that military science could devise. Yet Cindy had penetrated the facility faster and more completely than any previous attempt, demonstrating capabilities that redefined what individual operators could accomplish. Colonel Vance stepped forward to address the assembled candidates, her expression serious as she prepared to reveal the full context of what they'd witnessed. "What you've seen tonight represents the future of special operations," she announced. "Modern threats require capabilities that go beyond traditional military training. We need operators who can defeat defensive systems that evolve faster than conventional tactics can adapt." She gestured toward the monitoring displays, still showing Cindy's successful extraction from the target facility. "Candidate Fowler represents exactly the kind of expertise that Delta Force must integrate to remain effective against tomorrow's challenges. Her background combines technical mastery with operational capability in ways that traditional military career paths don't develop." The briefing that followed revealed the true purpose of the selection cycle that the candidates had been participating in. Rather than standard evaluation for existing positions, they were being assessed for roles in an expanded Delta Force that would incorporate cyber warfare specialists, defensive system experts, and technology integration officers alongside traditional direct action operators. "The military landscape is changing," Vance explained. "Physical courage and tactical competence remain essential, but they're no longer sufficient. Future missions will require teams that combine your operational experience with technical capabilities like those candidate Fowler possesses." As candidates processed this information, many were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about their own assumptions and behaviors. The social dynamics that had developed over the past week, the casual dismissals, the subtle exclusions, the assumptions about capability and belonging, had been directed at someone whose qualifications exceeded their own. Cindy emerged from the transport vehicle that had retrieved her from the target site, her expression calm and professional, despite having just accomplished something that elite military units had considered impossible. She approached the group with the same quiet confidence she'd maintained throughout selection, showing no acknowledgement of the dramatic shift in how her presence was being perceived. "Outstanding work," Colonel Vance said simply, her praise carrying weight that everyone present understood. The aftermath was subdued as candidates grappled with revelations that challenged everything they'd believed about military excellence and professional competence. Many realized that their traditional understanding of special operations was becoming obsolete, replaced by requirements that demanded broader thinking and more diverse capabilities. Staff Sergeant Blackwood approached Cindy with obvious discomfort, his earlier confidence replaced by genuine humility. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "We were wrong about everything." Her response was gracious but firm. "No apology necessary. You evaluated based on the information you had and the standards you understood. The mission environment is changing in ways that require all of us to adapt our thinking." Over the following hours, as candidates completed their final evaluations and prepared for selection results, the conversations reflected fundamental shifts in understanding about what modern warfare required from its elite practitioners. Physical capabilities remained important, but intellectual flexibility and technical expertise were becoming equally critical for mission success. When final selection results were announced 2 days later, Cindy Fowler was among the 7 candidates chosen for advanced Delta Force training. But more significantly, she was designated as the lead instructor for a new program that would train traditional operators in the technical skills necessary for contemporary threats. The selection cycle that had begun with dismissive assumptions about a perceived outsider had concluded with recognition that the future of special operations lay in expanding definitions of excellence beyond traditional military paradigms. Cindy Fowler hadn't just earned acceptance into Delta Force, she'd helped redefine what Delta Force would become. As candidates departed Fort Bragg for their next assignments, many carried with them lessons that went beyond tactical training or physical conditioning. They'd learned that competence took many forms, that excellence couldn't be measured by single metrics, and that the most dangerous assumption was believing that their existing understanding of capability was complete. For Cindy Fowler, the journey from overlooked intelligence analyst to Delta Force instructor represented validation of a different path to military excellence. She'd proven that expertise earned through intellectual rigor and technical mastery could be just as valuable as courage developed through combat experience. Sometimes the most powerful statement isn't made through strength or aggression, but through quiet competence that speaks louder than any boast. Sometimes the best revenge against underestimation is simply being exactly who you are when everyone expects you to be less. And sometimes, the future belongs to those who think differently about problems that conventional wisdom considers unsolvable. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.